He kōna I purangi tēnei nā te reo irirangi o Aotearoa.
Welcome to another episode of No Stupid Questions with Susan Edmunds, the podcast that gets you answers to all the money questions you've ever wanted to ask, and maybe some that hadn't yet even crossed your mind. I'm Susan Edmunds, I'm RNZ's money correspondent. Thanks so much for all the questions that have come our way so far. Remember, you can email them or voice memo them to us at questions@rnz.co.nz. I'm joined by Justin Gregory.
I'm the one who asks the stupid questions, on other people's behalf, of course, but here we go. All right.
It's another busy week for money stuff, so let's get into it.
And our first question is from Denise, who raised a couple of points. First, she said her partner recently gave a piece of land to his daughter, and people who've heard about it have been surprised to hear that this could affect his ability to access a rest home subsidy. What's going on there?
Well, Denise mentioned this in regards to gifting rules. So New Zealand abolished gift duty in 2011. In general, gifts aren't subject to tax, no matter how much you want to give to people if you're feeling generous. But as she says, there are still rules relating to gifting and rest home subsidies. As we talked about last week, you can only have a rest home subsidy if you meet a means test. So as a couple, you need to not have more than just under $160,000 in assets on top of your car and house, or just under $300,000 if you do include the value of your house and car. But if you've given away your money, you might still be caught. The limit's $8,000 a year for the last 5 years to a total of $40,000 in assets, or $80,000 if you're a couple and you're both applying, and also up to $27,000 a year longer than 5 years ago. So that's something to watch out for, and it basically means you can't get yourself to qualify for the subsidy by giving away your house or something to your kids when you need to go into care.
I suppose if you tried to do that, couldn't you? You could give away parcels of your money to your kids, and then after you retire and you get a rest home, they could give little gifts back to you of money, and that way you'd be fiddling the system. But they've thought of that, haven't they?
Yes, that's right. So when you're in a rest home, you can only give away little bits of your money over time.
Rats. All right, never mind. Okay, Denise also asked whether there might be issues with the way she and her partner own their house. Her partner owns the house they live in, and his will leaves it to his daughter, but the will also allows Denise to stay in it as long as she likes. And she wants to know how that would work if her partner ended up going into a rest home.
Yeah, I think this is the same situation as anyone else, to be honest. If he's alive, he still owns the house and she's allowed to live in it, and they have to meet that $160,000-ish means test. And if he dies, the house goes to his daughter, but at that point, he's not needing the rest home subsidy anyway. And it could be that at that point, she would find it easier to qualify for the rest home subsidy herself, if need be.
Good luck. And the next question is from Brian, who asks, why can't the GST come off healthy food, which potentially over time would have less impact on our crippled health system, his words, not mine, and then be higher on fast food, which might help subsidise the benefit system? Again, Brian's words, not mine.
Yeah, I've wondered whether this is going to pop up as an election issue again this time around, because it is something that keeps coming up. We're quite unusual internationally in that our GST is applied to basically everything, with minor exceptions for things like financial products and that sort of thing. It's really simple and straightforward, which is something that people often say is a really good thing about it. I talked to Infometrics Chief Executive Brad Olsen and asked him if the reason we haven't done anything like GST off food is that it's just too administratively expensive to start making it more complex.
I mean, the administrative cost and defining what's in or out is part of it, don't get me wrong. I mean, Australia's got a whole industry of deciding what type of bread is ruled in or out. So like there is a legitimate high administrative cost and a real question around, like what is being included there. But the other part is taking a step back. What's the problem here that we think there is that requires this change? And if, as most people normally put it, well, people are paying too much for good, nutritious food or for fresh food, whatever it might be, to which I'd go, it seems a little bit that you're then providing a universal solution to a targeted issue, i.e., I'm pretty sure that your listener here isn't actually saying that it's too expensive for a millionaire to buy caviar, which is a fresh food. But under a GST off all fresh food or all healthy foods or however you defined it, you'd be giving a heck of a lot more support to the millionaire buying caviar all the time than you would to anyone else. Look, this is a very common barbecue sort of around the barbecue question. I've had it a number of times. And it normally is that people say, well, people who can't afford good food are really struggling. Which I go, cool, let's provide that group with support, rather than GST, which is across the board. The beauty of the GST system is that it is a flat tax across basically everything, and that it doesn't have those distortions. In fact, everyone else around the world would love to have a GST system like ours without those distortions, because then you start to have people that would start doing funny things with their products. You would have people, this is where the administrative burden comes in as well, but you would have people that tried to make products that sort of fit the bill in a certain way, in terms of, well, we'll go down the angle of we'll cut one certain thing from our product, and all of a sudden, is a Subway sandwich now, a healthy food or a fresh food. Is McDonald's. It's got tomatoes in it. Do you only sort of half rate a Macca's cheeseburger or something?
Yeah.
And to everyone that says, well, clearly that wouldn't be included. Okay, well, fine, we'd put some limits on it. So would orange juice be included? Well, of course, but it might have too high of a sugar content because it's got a certain amount of sugar in it. So all of this just becomes a sort of thing where, again, you have this awful rule in, rule out. People then go, well, let's talk about the packaging or not. And you go, okay, well, nothing that has packaging can be a fresh food. Cool. Then cucumbers, which are wrapped in plastic, are out, or bags of lettuce or spinach are out because they're in bags. So again, you go down, is this really the best way to try and sort, if people can't afford the basics, that we provide one, a huge challenge to everyone and a huge boon for lawyers and accountants to figure out what's in or out. And also, the difficulty is that a change to an indirect tax like GST doesn't necessarily mean you'd see any change in price. We had this discussion quite a bit when the Labour Party had their idea to take GST off fresh and frozen fruits and vegetables. Well, if the supermarkets know that people will pay X dollars for a product, which they do because people currently buy them, that doesn't necessarily mean that the actual retail price would change, or that it wouldn't adjust and similar over time, because we currently know where people are willing to pay. So there's all of those elements. But the biggest one for me, when it comes back to the question of, well, what's the problem we're trying to solve, is that if it's a specific group in society that aren't able to afford those basics, those essentials, then you provide for them, not for everyone. Now, look, you could do that in broadly two ways, and these are sort of theoretical. One, you could provide more support either through the likes of, if they're on a benefit, an increase in benefit levels. You could provide more money, and then people can decide what they want to buy every week. Or, if you really wanted to, and this is where you see the food and schools sort of program, government procures it directly. And so if the point there is that the government reckons that, a group in society isn't getting enough fruit, then maybe the government would buy a bunch of fruit. At least then it knows that it's directly getting the fruit and it directly knows what product it's getting. But the best option here is still always going to be let people choose what they need, and so provide that sort of more targeted support. Really taking GST, or proposing to take GST off fresh fruits and vegetables, healthy food, however you want to define it, there is a huge administrative cost and real difficulty of pinning down exactly what we're talking about. There is a lack of targeting that makes it really challenging to figure out if this is a solution that's going in search of a problem, or at least the right way to try and solve a problem. And there's that element that it's not definite that any cost savings would actually be passed on to the end consumer.
So that does make sense to me. I guess the other aspect that's worth considering is that GST is quite regressive. Lower income people spend more of their income on it than higher income people do. All
right, and then the second half of the question, what about the idea of higher taxes on unhealthy food?
Yeah, I know there's some evidence in support of sugar taxes. In 2020, Auckland Uni said a 20% tax on sugar-sweetened beverages would raise about $40 million a year, which could be recycled back into the community. But I imagine we'd have some of those same issues coming through again, though, of what counts as an unhealthy beverage or whatever, who decides and who bears the brunt of it.
And next, we have a question from Sarah. She wants some tips because she's about to move into a house with her partner and her kids and her mother. She says she and her husband will pay the mortgage and the power will be split across 2 meters, which should make that bit somewhat easier. But other than that, they'll be paying 80-20 for rates, gas, broadband, insurance and food. So 80% paid by Sarah and her husband, 20% paid by her mother. So in practical terms then, she wants to know, should they make the account that they get paid into the bills account and then have her mum pay a set amount each month? And, how do they budget for gas? What's the best way to make this work? What are your thoughts, Susan?
Well, I went and talked to David Verry, who's a financial mentor at North Harbour Budgeting Service, about this because he's quite good with all this sort of thing. So he says a good place to start is to look at what has been paid previously. So take the last 6 or even better 12 months and work out what each expense cost and then work that out on a monthly basis to see what her mother might need to contribute. So some expenses may be set for the next 6 or 12 months. Sarah mentioned food boxes. That's probably something that is coming. Things like rates, insurance, broadband are probably the same, so you can calculate them with some accuracy. But it's things like groceries that tend to move around a bit, but he says that you can average those out and it should work out pretty well over a year. He says it will miss a cost of living increase going forward, but if you do it over 12 months, it does take into account seasonal fluctuations. Fruit and veg may be more expensive at certain times of the year. And then you'll need to keep checking on this because when you move into your new place, things could change a bit, but over time you should still see a pattern that you can work with. He says vehicles can be a bit tricky depending on who pays for what. Is her mum going to pay for her own car sort of thing, But you could keep a mileage log if you really wanted to get specific about paying for fuel. He says repairs and maintenance are the big unknowns and he generally defaults to budgeting $400 or $500 a year for that. And then when it comes to gas and electricity, he recommends averaging it out based on a previous year of use. This will be hard going into a new place, but I have found that your power company can sometimes give you an estimate of what you're likely to pay into the future, and that's probably the same for gas. And then as for the account structure, he recommends having 3. So you have a general account that income goes into, and then your weekly and fortnightly expenses are paid out of. Then you have a monthly account for your monthly bills, and you transfer a bit into that account every time you're paid, and you let it sort of build up to cover seasonal movements. And then you have an annual account for things you only pay for, once a year, and that could maybe be something that earns a bit of interest as well. And he says maybe Sarah's mum could make one payment a week or month, and then the person running the general account makes sure that all the bills are paid. So he says account structure is very family dependent and what works best for you. He says in his household, he puts as much as he can on his credit card because then he gets, points, airport lounge passes, that sort of thing. But then he ensures that he pays the full balance every month and makes the most of that interest-free period that you can get to. But whether that works for you will be up to your own circumstances, really.
Audience question time. Last week, our question for you was whether things were better off, financially that is, for households in the 1980s.
Yes, I know from my email inbox that this can be a controversial question. I spoke to Shamubeel Eaqub, who points out that it was a period of huge structural change in the 80s when unemployment got very high, which would have been really difficult for lots of people, especially when wages were going backwards at some points in real terms due to inflation. We've been through a really serious recession lately, but it's not that same kind of everything changing upheaval.
Inflation was so high through the period. You can't look at it in nominal terms. You do have to look at it in real terms. And you can see that, real mortgage rates, yes, they had spiked up, but they're probably kind of similar to where they are at the moment. But they were generally a little bit higher once inflation came down in the early 1990s. But through the 1980s, I'd say they're probably not that far off. It's just that you're carrying like a gazillion times more debt because house prices are just so much higher. So if you had a job, then relative to your incomes, you had a smaller debt. So you had more chance of being able to afford it. But in comparison now, house prices are much higher, mortgages a lot more. So those mortgage rates, even though in real terms are not that much lower or higher, the impact on people's household budgets is a hell of a lot higher.
And I also talked to Craig Renney, who's policy director at the CTU, who said it was a mixed picture. Some things are definitely better. You have to say if you're a single woman, for example, the financial picture must be better now than it was in the 80s because there are fewer hurdles in your way. But he says things are maybe more of a grind now for some people than they were 40 years ago.
What's happened is we're working longer hours. There are more of us in work, but many of us still can't make ends meet. The consequence, the number of working poor has probably increased, and the number of people who might be officially poor, i.e. have a very low income, might have fallen since the 80s, but everyone's working more hours.
Okay.
Everyone's doing more work, and as a consequence, they're still working and they're still not getting ahead.
He also said the CTU tracks how many hours a minimum wage worker has to work to pay the lower quartile rent, and that has gone up year after year. We're joined to tackle this one by incoming business editor Corin Dann, who's been delving into the 80s a bit in his very good podcast Context. Corin, what do you think? Did New Zealanders have it financially better in the 80s?
I think it's a really interesting question. I think it's a mixed picture. Having done some recent episodes in Context, it sometimes felt looking at the 80s like it was a different country when you think about the market reforms and how our economy changed late 80s. I think it's very clear to me, growing up, getting hold of, I was big into my records and music and that sort of stuff, that always felt a lot more expensive. And if you think about it, I think getting access to music and entertainment, televisions, consumable goods like that nowadays, I would say it's a lot more affordable than it would have been in the 80s. Maybe vinyl's an exception because it's got trendy again and it's still $80 to buy a record now new, but it was probably about the same equivalent back then. But music accessibility, when you think about streaming, is so much cheaper. So that stuff, and then you think too, in the 90s and the 2000s, as China and Asia started ramping up their factories and we had deflation, all these goods, I mean, the price of a TV, what you can get, it just seems extraordinary. So if that's what you're into, then I would say it's way more affordable now. But if you go and look at some of the core things around living, housing costs, some aspects of public transport, fuel, electricity, I think you'd find a more complicated picture where it was probably has got more expensive to a degree now, certainly housing, but then you flip it around and you go, well, okay, housing was cheaper in the 80s relative to your income. It was probably 4 or 5 times income compared to 9 or 10 now. It's possibly, around that level. But how easy was it to get a loan? Difficult. So it's complicated.
Yeah, they talk about the second mortgages and stuff, don't they?
Yeah, no, I can remember people that I have talked to about this saying they'd have to get bridging finance to get their loan for a house, which didn't sound like it was a particularly expensive house. But so getting loans is obviously easier. Then there's the whole question of interest rates, which gets baby boomers and Gen X and Gen Z super wound up, doesn't it? Because it's one side saying, oh, well, in my day it was 19% interest rates,
yes.
Which is true because they did go to that level at one point. But for large parts of the 80s, wages, which are often being set by awards, were sort of matching that. They weren't perfectly matching them, but you were getting, people would have been getting, so the real interest rates wouldn't have been as extreme as 19%, would it? But I think the problem then is that, of course, is that it just seems like such a hassle back then. You'd have to be constantly worrying about inflation running at 15 or 16%, and then so wage rounds have got to match that. It just seems like it would have been a lot more confusing. And then you had things like the price freeze that Muldoon brought in the early 80s to try and stop it, and then that worked for a while, of course, but then it didn't work because as soon as it came off, everything went through the roof, and you had the oil shocks. So maybe there were some things that were cheaper back then, but maybe life has got better in other ways.
I had a question lined up for you, but I think you've just answered it for me. So if you had to pick, would you rather be alive in 1985 or 2025?
Well, I'd rather be alive now. I do think, as much as I pine for a great upbringing and a wonderful grandparents who had a very simple life, I do think that nowadays, when you think of the opportunities, in terms of the way in which our economy has evolved, the different things people can do, the different fields, the ability to follow your dreams, so to speak, and really specialise, is better. So I think, clearly, our living standards, whilst they could be better and our cost of living could be better, overall, I am an optimist in the sense that I think that New Zealand has progressed. Now, it's debatable as to whether we could have progressed in a better way over the last 20, 30 years and whether our productivity has been good enough, all those sorts of things. While I think there were some big negatives from the way in which the economy was opened up in the 80s in terms of the way it dealt with social welfare and aspects around job losses and some of the collateral damage there. Doing Context, it was clear to me that some of that, it really was harmful and intergenerational. I do think that being an open and much more interconnected with the world has made New Zealand a far more interesting and diverse and better place.
So that brings us to the end of our episode. Now we've got a new listener question. What year was New Zealand's highest unemployment rate and how high did it go?
Send your answers and any other money questions you might have to questions@rnz.co.nz. Voice memos are very welcome too.
Bye for now.
No Stupid Questions with Susan Edmunds was written and presented by Susan Edmunds. Justin Gregory is the producer. The engineer is Phil Benj. Thanks to Denise, Brian and Sarah for the questions, and Brad Olsen, David Verry, Shamubeel Eaqub, Craig Renney and Corin Dann, yes that's me, for their answers. Now if you like the show and all its 80s content, then check out some others from RNZ, like, just for example, of course, Context. Guy and Espina and I explore the backstory to today's front page and ask, how did we get here? Follow and listen to No Stupid Questions with Susan Edmunds on Apple Podcasts, Spotify or any podcast app so you don't miss an episode.